My name is Frank Holloway, and today I'm turning 65, though nobody in my family seems particularly concerned with that fact. Funny how life twists itself into shapes you never anticipated. You spend decades building a family, convincing yourself that the fingerprints you leave on your children's lives are permanent, only to discover they wash off with the first rain of inheritance money. I wasn't always this cynical. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago, I was half of a whole, married to my Eleanor for 42 beautiful, complicated years. We'd raised 3 children, weathered the usual storms of mortgage payments and teenager rebellions, and were finally planning that trip to the Greek islands we'd been postponing since our honeymoon. Then came the diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, the kind doctors don't bother sugarcoating because there's no amount of sugar that can mask that particular bitterness. 87 days. That's how long it took from "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway" to me, standing alone beside a mahogany casket, surrounded by flower arrangements that Eleanor would have called ostentatious, in that whispered tone she reserved for things that embarrassed her. Our children, Michael, 39, Rebecca, 36, and Thomas, 33, stood beside me, a trio of well-dressed strangers bound by DNA and collective history, but separated by the chasm grief carves between people. What no one expected, least of all me, was the life insurance payout. Eleanor, my practical coupon-clipping wife who darned socks until they were more darn than sock, had somehow ended up with a policy that paid out just over $1 million. Some investment rider that had compounded over decades, the details of which were explained to me by a sympathetic agent, while I nodded, understanding nothing except that my wife's death had made me wealthy. I divided it equally, $250,000 each to our 3 children, keeping the same amount for myself. "For your futures," I'd said, imagining college funds for grandchildren, mortgage payments accelerated, perhaps a cushion for hard times. I kept my portion mostly untouched in a separate account, a mausoleum of digital numbers that felt too much like profiting from my loss. The transformation in my children wasn't immediate, more like watching time-lapse photography of a flower wilting in reverse, a slow unfurling into something that looked vibrant but felt artificial. Michael, my oldest, and always the most ambitious, upgraded from his practical Volvo to a gleaming Tesla. "It's an investment in sustainable technology, Dad." Then from his modest colonial to a sprawling McMansion in Oakwood Heights. The kind of house with a 3-car garage for 2 adults and more bathrooms than could possibly be used simultaneously, unless he was hosting some kind of digestive convention. Rebecca, my middle child and only daughter, quit her job teaching English to pursue her passions, which apparently involved starting a lifestyle consultancy business that, as far as I could tell, consisted primarily of posting photos of herself in luxury hotel rooms on social media. The same daughter who now lives in my guest house rent-free, but somehow couldn't find time to replace the porch light that burned out 2 months ago. And Thomas, my youngest, the sensitive one who'd always been Eleanor's shadow. Well, Thomas mostly disappeared. He'd surface for obligatory family dinners, arrive late, leave early, and spend the intervening time checking his phone with the anxious devotion of someone monitoring life support systems. He'd recently started bringing a girlfriend named Kira, who called me Mr. H and seemed physically incapable of making eye contact with anyone over 40. Perhaps I'm being unfair. Grief rewires brains, unmoors personalities. Maybe their behavioral shifts weren't about the money, but about navigating a world without their mother's gravitational pull. That's what I told myself anyway. It's what fathers do. We construct elaborate scaffoldings of rationalization around our children's behavior, supporting the weight of our disappointment with the steel beams of unconditional love. But today, my 65th birthday, the scaffolding finally collapsed. It started with a text message at 7:42 a.m., jarring me awake from a dream where Eleanor and I were dancing in our kitchen to Sinatra, as we used to do on Sunday mornings while making pancakes. "Morning, Dad. Happy birthday. Slight change of plans for tonight. We're thinking of doing something more intimate for your celebration, just immediate family at Michael's house. His chef is preparing something special. We'll do your cake this weekend instead. Love you tons. Becca. Rebecca, who hadn't called me Dad since high school, always preferring Daddy even into her 30s. Rebecca, who knew perfectly well that I'd been planning a simple dinner at Salvatore's, the Italian place Eleanor and I had gone for every birthday and anniversary for 4 decades. Rebecca, whose text felt like it had been drafted by a PR firm, specializing in familial disappointments. I set my phone down on the nightstand, next to the empty space where Eleanor's reading glasses used to sit. The house creaked around me. An old man inside an older house, both of us gradually settling into our foundations. By 9:15 a.m., my phone chimed again. Michael, this time. Hey, Dad, you get Rebecca's text? We're doing something special tonight. Just us. 7 p.m. at my place, no presents necessary, see you then. Michael, no presents necessary. As if I, a man who had spent 40 years as a high school woodshop teacher before retiring, would ever buy a gift rather than make one. As if the turned cherry wood box containing a compass that had belonged to my father was something that could be dismissed as unnecessary. I didn't respond to either text. Instead, I showered, dressed, and made myself a breakfast Eleanor would have scolded me for. Just black coffee and half a grapefruit, no protein to speak of. I sat at our kitchen table, morning light filtering through curtains she'd sewn herself, and allowed myself to feel the weight of everything. The quiet in this house that used to vibrate with life. The careful coordination between my children. That felt less like consideration and more like management of an obligation. The growing certainty that tonight's intimate celebration had nothing to do with honoring my birth and everything to do with keeping me occupied while something else, something more important, took place. At 10:23 a.m., I called Salvatore's and cancelled my reservation for 5. Gloria, who had been greeting us at that restaurant since Michael was in diapers, made a small noise of disappointment. But Mr. Holloway, it's your birthday tradition, she said, her Italian accent still strong after 50 years in America. Mrs. Holloway would want you to keep traditions. Mrs. Holloway had a lot of opinions about how things should be, I replied, but she's not here to enforce them anymore. The silence that followed carried the specific gravity of having said aloud what people prefer, left unspoken. I apologized for the short notice, promised to come in soon for the veal parmesan, and hung up before Gloria could press the issue. That's when I decided. If my own birthday was to be reimagined without my input, then I would reimagine it entirely on my terms, and I knew exactly where to start. Eleanor had volunteered at Sunnyside Children's Home for the last 15 years of her life, reading to the kids, organizing art projects, sometimes just sitting with the ones who needed extra attention. Even during chemo, she'd insist I drive her there, claiming those children's laughter was better medicine than anything they were pumping into her veins. I hadn't been back since her memorial service, where the staff had presented me with a handmade book of memories the children had created. It had been too raw then, seeing those colorful crayon drawings of my wife, reading the misspelled messages of love from children who somehow understood the permanence of death better than most adults. But suddenly, on this milestone birthday, that my own flesh and blood couldn't be bothered to properly acknowledge, it felt right, essential even. The drive to Sunnyside took 23 minutes, past strip malls that used to be cornfields and housing developments with names like Whispering, Meadows, despite the conspicuous absence of both Whispering and Meadows. The children's home itself was unchanged, a sprawling Victorian that had once belonged to some railroad baron, donated to the county in the 1950s, and converted to house up to 30 kids at a time. I hadn't called ahead, half expecting to be turned away at the door like some kind of suspicious character. Instead, the receptionist, a young woman with purple-streaked hair and more facial piercings than I could politely pretend not to notice, looked up from her computer and actually smiled. "Mr. Holloway," she said, standing. "Oh my gosh, we were just talking about you yesterday. Mrs. Peterson found an old photo of you and Mrs. Holloway at the Halloween party a few years back, the one where you dressed as Carl and Ellie from Up," I finished, feeling something loosen in my chest at the memory, complete with balloons and everything. "That's it, I'm Zoe, by the way. I started after, well, I never got to meet your wife, but everyone here still talks about her all the time. There's something disarming about being in a place where you're Grief isn't the elephant in the room, but rather an acknowledged presence like comfortable furniture everyone's used to navigating around. "It's my birthday," I said, surprising myself with the admission. 65 today. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought actually, just felt like I should be here. Zoe's expression softened into something that wasn't quite pity. Thank He, God, but rather understanding. Mrs. Holloway always said birthdays were sacred. She glanced at her computer screen. Actually, this might be perfect timing. We've got a situation in the activity room. The situation turned out to be a birthday party on the verge of collapse. One of the kids, a serious-faced boy named Marcus who was turning 10, was sitting alone at a decorated table while two harried staff members attempted to frost a lopsided cake. The volunteer who'd promised to handle the celebration had called in sick, leaving them scrambling. I stood in the doorway taking in the scene, the streamers hanging crookedly from the ceiling, the small pile of wrapped gifts, donations most likely, and this solemn child trying so hard to look like he didn't care that his special day was unraveling. Something shifted inside me, like tumblers falling into place in a lock I didn't know. Needed opening. "I have an idea," I said to Mrs. Peterson, the program director who'd appeared beside me. "If you'll trust me with the keys to the supply closet and maybe the petty cash fund." What happened next still feels dreamlike in my memory. A 65-year-old widower on his birthday, suddenly transforming into a one-man party planning committee. I raided the craft supplies to create proper decorations. I called in a favor from Gino at Pastry Palace, who'd made every birthday cake for my family since Michael's first. "I need something spectacular for a 10-year-old boy, superhero theme if possible, in about 2 hours." 2 hours? Frank, you're killing me. "It's my birthday, Gino." A pause. "Well, why didn't you say so? I'll make it work. Pick it up at noon." Next was Party Central, where I filled a cart with proper decorations. Those pointy hats no one really wants to wear, but everyone secretly expects, and small gift bags for every child at Sunnyside. The cashier, a teenager with the specific boredom that can only be cultivated through minimum-wage retail work, raised her eyebrows at the quantity. "Big family?" she asked, scanning package after package of party favors. "Getting bigger by the minute," I replied. By 2 p.m., the activity room at Sunnyside had been transformed. Blue and red streamers hung from the ceiling in careful patterns. Superhero tablecloths covered the industrial folding tables. Every child had a gift bag with small toys, candy, and a gift card to the local ice cream shop Eleanor had always taken, her special reading buddies too. And in the center of it all was Gino's masterpiece, a 3-tier cake with Spider-Man climbing up one side and "Happy Birthday Marcus" written in perfect comic book font. Marcus, who I learned had been in the system since he was 3, kept looking at me like I might disappear if he blinked too long. "Is this really all for me?" he asked when he saw the cake. "Every bit of it," I told him. 10 is a big deal, double digits, practically grown. He nodded seriously, a child carrying the weight of adult disappointments on shoulders too small for the burden. "I'm the man of the house now." Something about the way he said it, this child with no house to be the man of, lodged itself in the tender part of my heart that I thought had calcified after Eleanor. "Well," I said, resting a hand on his shoulder, "today you're the king of the castle. And kings get to make wishes when they blow out candles." The party was chaotic in the specific way that children's joy always is, loud and sticky and perfect. I found myself in the middle of it all, cutting cake slices that inevitably fell apart, adjudicating disputes over whether Spider-Man could definitely beat Batman, taking photos with Mrs. Peterson's camera to be printed later for the kids' memory. Books. Somewhere between helping a little girl named Destiny clean frosting from her hair and teaching a group of boys how to fold paper airplanes that actually fly, I realized I was having the best birthday I'd had in years. Maybe the best since Eleanor's diagnosis had cast its shadow over everything that came after. It wasn't until the party was winding down, sugar crashes imminent, staff beginning the daunting task of restoration, that I noticed the woman with the press badge. She'd slipped in sometime during the chaos and was now talking quietly with Mrs. Peterson in the corner, occasionally glancing in my direction. Local news, Zoe explained when she caught me looking. They do human interest stories sometimes. Marcus has been in 8 foster homes in 5 years. They were going to do a piece on his birthday, but now... She gestured around at the transformed room, the smiling children, the remains of what had become a proper celebration. Now they've got something unexpected to report. I nodded, not thinking much of it. One more picture for Marcus to remember his 10th birthday by. That seemed fair. The reporter, Jenny Krebs from Channel 8 News, according to her badge, approached as I was helping collect discarded wrapping paper. "Mr. Holloway, I understand you're the mastermind behind all this." She gestured at the room with a well-manicured hand. "Mrs. Peterson says you just showed up this morning and transformed everything." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the characterization. "I just made a few calls. These kids deserve a proper celebration." "I understand it's your birthday too. That's quite a coincidence." I considered deflecting, but found myself too tired for the effort of lying. 65 today. Seemed like a good day to remember what matters. Something in her expression shifted, journalist's instinct recognizing a story beneath the surface. "And your own family? They must be proud of your generosity." A laugh escaped me before I could catch it, a rusty sound like a door hinge that needs oil. "My family is having an intimate celebration tonight. Very exclusive. I only found out this morning that my invitation had been limited." Jenny's eyebrows rose slightly. "So instead of being upset about being excluded, you came here and created all this for a child you'd never met?" Put like that, it sounded either pathetically desperate or impossibly noble. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the complicated middle, a landscape Eleanor had always navigated better than I. "My wife volunteered here for many years," I said finally. "She believed birthdays were sacred. No one should feel forgotten on the day that celebrates their existence. Would you mind if we did a short interview? This is exactly the kind of community story our viewers connect with." I almost refused. I'm a private person by nature, shaped by a generation that believed in quiet dignity rather than social media exhibitionism. But something stopped me. Perhaps the memory of Eleanor's voice in my head saying, "Oh, don't be such a stick in the mud, Frank." "All right," I heard myself say, "but this is about Marcus and Sunnyside, not me." The interview took place in the small garden behind the Victorian, where Eleanor had planted perennials that would continue blooming long after she was gone. Jenny asked thoughtful questions about my connection to Sunnyside, about Eleanor's volunteer work, about why birthdays mattered. "And will you be celebrating your own milestone birthday later?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. I hesitated, weighing honesty against propriety. "My children have arranged something at my son's house tonight. Very exclusive affair." "You don't sound particularly excited about it." "Let's just say I've learned that as you get older, birthdays become complicated." She nodded, seeming to accept my diplomatic evasion. Then, just as the cameraman was lowering his equipment, she asked one final question. "Mr. Holloway, I couldn't help but notice your late wife's insurance policy. Is that what's funding your generosity today?" I stiffened, blood rushing to my face. "Excuse me?" "According to public records, there was a substantial payout after her death. I'm just curious how that's affected your family dynamics, especially given your children's recent lifestyle upgrades." The ground seemed to shift beneath me. Public records, my children's lifestyles? What exactly had this woman been investigating? "I don't see how that's relevant to today's story," I managed, voice tight. Jenny's expression was sympathetic but determined. "Human interest stories are about the whole human, Mr. Holloway. Our viewers connect with real struggles. And from what I understand, your children have been living quite lavishly on their inheritance while you're spending your birthday alone at a children's home." My first instinct was to end the interview immediately, to protect my family, as I'd been doing instinctively for decades, but something stopped me. A cold clarity cutting through the fog of denial I'd been living in. "My wife's policy paid out more than we expected," I said slowly. "I divided it equally between myself and my 3 children. How they choose to use that money is their business, even when they use it to fund a lavish dinner party tonight at your son's house, a dinner party you weren't invited to because it would be, quote, Awkward to have Dad there when we're celebrating with the life insurance money. End quote. The world tilted sideways. What did you just say? Jenny looked genuinely uncomfortable, now as if she'd overstepped even her own journalistic boundaries. I may have received a tip from someone on your son's household staff. About tonight's real purpose, I assumed you knew. I didn't respond. Couldn't really, past the roaring in my ears and the vice grip tightening around my chest. Mr. Holloway, are you all right? Should I get someone? I managed to shake my head, focusing on breathing through the revelation that felt like a physical blow. My children, my own flesh and blood, were throwing a party with their mother's death money on my birthday and had deliberately excluded me because my presence would cast an inconvenient shadow on their celebration. When I finally spoke, my voice came from somewhere distant and cold. No, I didn't know. But I'm not particularly surprised either. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Ask your questions, Ms. Krebs. Something had solidified inside me, grief crystallizing into a diamond-hard resolve. I believe in honesty. It's what I taught my children, though the lesson doesn't seem to have stuck. What followed was the most candid interview of my life. I spoke about Eleanor's death, about the unexpected insurance money, about watching my children transform in ways that broke my heart. I talked about the text messages that morning, about the cancelled reservation at Salvatore's, about finding purpose at Sunnyside when my own family had made me redundant. My wife used to say that we're defined by how we handle the plot twists. Life throws at us, I said toward the end. Today's plot twist was discovering that while my biological family may have forgotten the meaning of birthdays, I have a whole room full of children in there who reminded me what celebration really means. When the interview ended, Jenny reached out to shake my hand. That was incredibly powerful, Mr. Holloway. Would you like to review the footage before we air it? Or perhaps reconsider some of your statements? I shook my head. I haven't said anything untrue, and I haven't named names or pointed fingers. If my children recognize themselves in my words, that's between them and their consciences. The segment will air on the 6 o'clock news. Tomorrow's follow-up might include some financial details we've been investigating regarding large purchases made by your children immediately following the insurance payout. I considered objecting, protecting them even now. Instead, I simply nodded. The truth has its own weight, Ms. Krebs. I've been carrying it alone for too long. As I drove home to prepare for the evening's intimate celebration, I felt strangely unburdened. Not happy exactly. The betrayal was too fresh for happiness, but lightened somehow. As if speaking my reality aloud had finally given me permission to see it clearly. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since I left Sunnyside. Text messages from all 3 children, each with slight variations on the same theme. Where was I? Was I all right? They'd been trying to reach me for hours. I ignored them all, parking in my driveway and entering the house that still held Eleanor's presence in every corner. I showered, then stood before my closet, considering what one wears to a birthday party that isn't actually for their birthday. In the end, I chose Eleanor's favorite, the blue button-down she'd given me for our last anniversary, paired with the cufflinks that had belonged to my father. I took extra care with my appearance, trimming my beard, applying the cologne Eleanor had always loved. On impulse, I retrieved the small cherry wood box from my workbench, the birthday gift I'd made for Michael, containing my father's compass. I wrapped it carefully in simple brown paper, tied with twine. Then, on second thought, I returned to my workshop and collected 2 more items I'd been saving: a delicate rose pendant carved from olive wood for Rebecca, and a refurbished pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather for Thomas. 3 generations of Holloway history, carefully preserved and now passing into hands that might not appreciate their value. But that was no longer my burden to carry. At precisely 6:55 p.m., I pulled into Michael's circular driveway, parking my sensible Buick between Rebecca's Range Rover and a sleek Jaguar I didn't recognize. Through the expansive front windows, I could see movement inside, people in cocktail attire mingling in the grand foyer, champagne flutes catching the light from the ridiculous chandelier Michael had installed last year. I sat for a moment, watching. This house that had been purchased with money from Eleanor's death, These people gathered to celebrate what exactly? The windfall that had transformed my children from hard-working middle-class professionals into whatever they had become at 6:59 p.m. My phone rang. Thomas this time. I answered, something I hadn't done all day. "Dad, where are you? We're all waiting. Are you okay?" "I'm in the driveway, Thomas, just taking a moment." "Oh, okay, great. We were worried. Just so you know, there are a few extra people here. Michael invited some of his business associates. It's still totally your birthday thing, though." The lie slid so easily from my son's mouth. The son who'd once been incapable of deception, who'd confessed to breaking a window before I'd even noticed the damage. I wondered when lying to me had become so effortless for him. "I'm sure it will. Be lovely, I'll be right in." I ended the call and checked the time. 7:01 p.m. The local news would have started 1 minute ago. Jenny Krebs and her human interest story about a 65-year-old widower spending his birthday, creating joy for forgotten children, would be airing right about now, including perhaps my unvarnished thoughts about the children who had used their mother's death money to fund a celebration they couldn't even be bothered to honestly explain to me. I stepped out of my car, gifts in hand, and walked toward the front door. Whatever happened next would be, as Eleanor would say, a plot twist worth witnessing.